In August 1911, a starving native man walked out of the California wilderness near Oroville. He spoke a language no one around him understood. He carried with him almost nothing, and yet, without anyone realizing it at first, he carried the remains of an entire shattered world. The newspapers called him a sensation. Anthropologists called him a discovery. History would remember him as Ishi. But that is not where this story begins. It begins decades earlier with massacres, displacement, hiding, and survival. Because Ishi was not simply found. He was the survivor of a people who had been hunted nearly out of existence. The man we call Ishi may never have told outsiders his true name. According to the Hearst Museum, following Yahi custom, he would not speak his name without a proper introduction from someone of his own people. So instead, he became known by the word Ishi, meaning simply man, in the language of the Yahi. The Yahi were the southernmost group of Yana-speaking people, living in the valleys and foothills east of the upper Sacramento River in Northern California. Ishi was probably born around 1860, at a time when his people were already facing enormous violence from settlers and militias moving into their homeland. To understand Ishi, you have to understand what happened to the Yahi. Hearst Museum states plainly that white settler militias systematically eliminated Yahi people during the 19th and early 20th centuries, as part of the broader genocide against Native Californians. This was not an accident of history. It was organized violence. By the time Ishi reached adulthood, the Yahi world had been devastated. Survivors hid in remote country, avoiding roads, settlements, ranches, and armed men. For years, perhaps decades, Ishi and the few family members left around him survived in secrecy, carrying a way of life that the surrounding society had already decided should disappear. Long before he entered the public eye, Ishi had lived through the private end of a civilization. The Hearst Museum says he spent much of his life in hiding with his family, trying to avoid settler assaults in Yahi territory. Imagine what that means. Not just fear for a day, but fear as a way of life. Food had to be found quietly. Fires had to be hidden. Contact with outsiders could mean death. And then, one by one, the people around him disappeared. By 1911, after the death of his family and the other remaining Yahi with him, Ishi was alone. On August 29, 1911, Ishi was cornered by dogs outside Oroville, California. Town officials jailed him, not knowing exactly who he was or what to do with him. Soon, they contacted the University of California Museum of Anthropology. Within days, Ishi was taken to San Francisco. UCSF's history timeline records the turning point clearly. In August 1911, Ishi emerged from the Butte County wilderness into Oroville. On September 4, 1911, T.T. Waterman brought him to San Francisco. What had been survival in silence instantly became public spectacle. At the museum in San Francisco, Ishi was employed to demonstrate Yahi culture. Hearst Museum says he spent much of his time on display for white audiences, making obsidian and glass projectile points, demonstrating fire making, and recording Yahi songs and stories. He also worked as a live-in custodian and research assistant. Berkeley News later described him as a pioneering figure in museum education and an early educator at UC Berkeley. Someone who shared language, stories, skills, creativity, and warmth with visitors and scholars. But the same history also forces us to admit something uncomfortable. Ishi was being treated both as a person and as an exhibit. Over just 6 months after the museum opened at Parnassus, UCSF records that 24,000 people visited and watched Ishi demonstrate arrow making and fire building. That number tells you everything about the fascination surrounding him and the unequal power of the world he had entered. Ishi became well known in San Francisco. Hearst Museum notes that he could be seen hunting on Mount Parnassus, walking in Golden Gate Park, making tools and sharing knowledge with museum visitors. Many who met him remembered his curiosity, grace, and generosity. But the institution around him was never neutral. Hearst Museum now explicitly recognizes that Ishi's role resembled indentured servitude and that he was objectified as a living exhibit. Even where friendship existed, including with Alfred Kroeber, there was still a deep imbalance of power. In summer 1914, Ishi reluctantly returned with anthropologists to the Deer Creek area, the land of his people and the site of family massacre, so they could document Yahi culture. That journey was not just fieldwork. It was a return to trauma. Ishi's final years were marked by repeated illness. UCSF's medical timeline shows multiple hospitalizations between 1911 and 1916, including respiratory infection, bronchopneumonia, abdominal pain, back pain, and eventually tuberculosis. By early 1915, tuberculosis had been diagnosed. On March 25, 1916, Ishi died at UC Hospital of Advanced Pulmonary Tuberculosis. He had survived violence, isolation, public display, and cultural rupture, only to be taken by a disease that ravaged San Francisco at the time. Ishi had asked to be cremated according to Yahi tradition, but after his death, that wish was violated. Hearst Museum says an autopsy was performed, and Alfred Kroeber later sent Ishi's brain to the Smithsonian for study. UCSF preserves Kroeber's anguished words, written from New York, "Science can go to hell." Yet the autopsy still happened. For decades, Ishi's brain remained separated from his cremated remains. The Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History repatriation summary states that his brain was held until descendants recovered his cremated remains, after which they were reunited. His remains were repatriated on August 10, 2000. Ishi's story is often told as the story of the last of his tribe. But if we stop there, we miss the deeper truth. His story is also about genocide, survival, museum ethics, native dignity, and the violence of turning a living person into a symbol. Berkeley News argues that today museums must move beyond objectifying native peoples and toward partnership with descendant communities. So perhaps the real question is not whether Ishi was the last. Perhaps the real question is what kind of world made a man walk out of the wilderness carrying the silence of an entire people, and then turned him into an exhibit. If this story still haunts us, it should.